Hey guys, welcome to this video where we're going to run through the revision that you need for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which the opposite theory to Piaget's theory of thought comes before language. And we're going to run through everything you need to know for the knowledge and the evaluation of this theory for the language section. So the first thing to know is that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was created by two people who were having similar ideas about the influence of language over thought at the same time, and they kind of joined their ideas together to name this theory the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And they essentially argue the opposite to what Piaget said. So they are going to argue that language comes first and influences the way that we think. It's probably the easiest way to understand it. Is language, the language you have and the language you use influences the way that you think and changes the thoughts that you have. So some ways that they kind of argue this and some examples. For example, they would say that if a language does not have a word for something, then we will not think about that thing. And I suppose that makes a lot of sense. If you don't have a word for something, if you don't talk about something in particular, then you never will actually think about that thing. So that kind of shows how the language and the words that you use influences what you think about. And they talk about different cultures quite a lot, and they mention how, the fact that different cultures have different languages and they talk about things in different ways, that it influences the way that these different cultures think about things. And a nice easy example to think about that is bread. If we were to think about bread in England, we would very much use the word bread, you'd probably think about like a loaf of bread. But if you were to mention bread in France, they're much more likely to think about something like a baguette because it's much more relevant to their culture. So it's a very different way of looking at things based on the language that they use and how it influences the way that they think. So basically, the opposite of Piaget and his theory, Sapir-Whorf says that language influences the way that we think. And we've got to run through some evidence to back up this theory. So what proof do they have, or what evidence do they have? And we talked about the idea of the perception of colours. So we always talk about these colours and we say, okay, well, how many different colours can you see here? And assuming that we all agree that the two colours in the middle are both blue and they're the same colour, they're just a different shade of blue, we are quite likely in the English language to say that there are 7 colours there. Yes, there's 8 boxes, but the 2 blues are the same colour, they're just a different shade, light blue and dark blue, so we say that there are 7 colours. However, when we go and we talk to some Russian speakers, they actually say that there are 8 colours, because they, in their language, have a different word for light blue and a different word for dark blue, therefore categorising and talking about those colours as separate things. So therefore, because they talk about those words in separate terms, they think that they're different colours, they think that they're separate things. So it really shows us that the language and the words that we are using in English and Russian is affecting the way that we think. So it shows that the words that we have for colours influence how we perceive the colours. So language is influencing perception, which is a thinking process. So thinking about the idea of the colours and the blues, to sort of back it up, we can say, well, who is faster to categorise these colours into light and dark colours? Is it an English person or is it a Russian person? And the evidence points out to us that it's actually the Russians that are a lot quicker to categorise these colours into different types of blue, into light and dark blue, because they have a word for light and dark blue. They are used to thinking about these colours in this way, whereas English speakers have to spend a little bit of time thinking about these colours. Is it a light version of blue? Is it a dark version of blue? And it takes us a little bit longer because we don't have the language for it. We don't think about it that much, whereas they do. So it really shows us that the language that we use influences the way that we think. What other evidence do the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis refer to? Well, they refer to Eskimos and their use for the language of snow. So in the English language, we essentially have one word for the word snow, but Eskimos have over 50 words. Some people say up to about 100 different words for snow. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis uses this as evidence to say that, these different words for snow in the Eskimo language allows them to perceive and think about the small differences in different types of snow that others wouldn't really think about and consider. And again, it makes a lot of sense because that's what their culture is like, that's what their sort of upbringing puts them into that situation and those experiences, whereas we don't, especially in England, we don't see a lot of snow, so we really don't think about it that much because we don't have many different words for snow. Final piece of evidence, if we talk about the sort of gendered language. Now in England, we don't really have a gendered language, but if you go to other countries like France and Spain and Germany, they have masculine and feminine words. So when we ask people from Germany what gender is the moon, they typically will argue that it is male. And if we were to ask a Spanish person, they would typically argue that it is a female. And this is because their language assigns a gender to the moon. So in German, they call it der Mond, which is the masculine version. And in Spanish, they call it la luna, which is the feminine version. So because they talk about the moon in a masculine or feminine way, it makes them think that the moon is a male or female. Therefore, once again, showing us that our language or their language is influencing the way that they think about the moon. So in terms of sort of summarising everything that I've talked about there so far, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is arguing that language comes first and influences the way that we think. They say that if a language has no words for something, then we won't think about it. They identify and may point out that cultures think differently about things because they've got different languages. So again, their language is influencing the way that different cultures think about things. The evidence that they rely on is the colour perception. Think about the English and the Russian speakers for the colour blue. The fact that Eskimos have over 50 words for snow, and the fact that the language that people use can affect the way that they think and perceive about the gender of objects, such as the moon. In terms of doing a knowledge question for the exam, something like outline the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis explanation of language development. Something like this should cover you to show a pretty good knowledge of the theory. It goes, the language that we speak influences our thoughts and thinking. The words we use affect how we think about things. If we do not have the language for an object, we will not think about it. Therefore, different cultures with different languages have different ways of thinking about things, showing that their language influences how they think. For example, German language assigns the male gender to the moon, so the Germans think of the moon as a man. So you've got a nice understanding with a bit of an example in there to show a good knowledge of this theory. Now, what about evaluating the theory? What could you say if you had a question which was more along the lines of evaluate the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is a more common question in the exam? Well, firstly, you've already got a lot of supporting evidence. So you can refer back to the video, you can mention the supporting evidence for the theory, and then you can back it up with the perception of colours between English and Russian people, the use of Eskimos, the use of gendered objects. You've got plenty of evidence there to say that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has evidence to support it. Next one says, what's the link between sophisticated language and education grades? Well, it actually turns out that students who have a higher level and a more sophisticated language actually go on to get higher GCSE grades. Now, this matches up with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis because these students with a more sophisticated language are able to think at a higher level. So it shows that their language is influencing their thinking process and their thought ability. So this is also really useful for students and teachers to know. If we want our students to think at a higher level, we can try and improve their language. So this is like a double evaluation. It's good evidence for the theory that an improved language will improve your thinking, but also very useful for teachers and students. Now, how could we criticise the theory? Well, what about people that can't speak? People that have grown up or been born without language or lose the ability of language do not lose the ability to think. Therefore, there must be a crossover here that the theory is not considering. Is it a case of that thought is developing at the same time as language? Does thought come first? It kind of just shows us that maybe the language is not necessarily influencing the thought as much as we think. Think about maybe feral children. Go and research Jeannie, the feral child who had no human interaction for about 13 years, grew up without language but was still very capable of thinking. Shows us that maybe language does not completely influence our thought. There is another theory. We have the theory from Piaget, so we can say that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is criticised by evidence for Piaget. Piaget has evidence that children don't say random things, that children think before they speak, making their schemas, matching their words up, showing that they are clearly thinking about the words that they use. Go back and watch the Piaget video if you want to check in on that one. And finally, the evidence from the Eskimos is somewhat challenged. Do the words for snow, did they really come first? So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is making reference to maybe some examples such as the Eskimos, which might not be true. Some people turn around and argue that the Eskimos don't actually have that many words for snow, that they are different types of snow. Also, there is the argument that if they do have more words for snow, that they probably had to think about it first to generate and make those words. Somebody somewhere had to make that word up, and how do you make a word up? Well, you've got to think about it first. So there is an argument contradicting the evidence that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis uses. So lots of positives and negatives there that you could use for a, say, 5-mark question. I would say as long as you know 3 evaluations, you will be more than covered for this in the exam. Right guys, that's everything you need to know for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of language, including the evaluation. Hopefully that makes sense. Combine this with the Piaget video, and these are the 2 theories debating the sort of origins of language and thought. Which one comes first, thought or language, language or thought, and which one influences the other.